series of the May session. We're hoping to bring it back again for our September session here in a month or two. And we will give it just another minute or so to let people come in. Hopefully we have a few more people join us since it is the end of the session and people are like, done with my project. So I have some time to do stuff now. So tonight our speaker is Jeff Dillon, and he is going to be presenting on project management. So Dillon, or I'm sorry, Jeff, whenever you would like, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen. And let me know, can you see the slides?
Yes, can see it clear.
Okay, great. And I'm opening up the chat window as well, so I can keep an eye on that. Okay, welcome everyone. So tonight we're going to be talking about project management, and I'd like to kick it off with a little bit of a detour into Mortal Kombat. So I think that project management is a lot like the video game Mortal Kombat. So let's hear it in the chat. Type into the chat. Let me know, are you guys familiar with Mortal Kombat, the video game? Yes, we've got one here, one fan. All right. Some are, some not. Button masher, awesome. Perfect. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Mortal Kombat is a video game where players try to destroy each other with skills and creativity to advance their reputation and their careers. And I think project management is a lot like that. But it's with spreadsheets instead of fists and weapons. And I think it's especially true for software projects. Now, with project management, of course, you're not fighting against other people, but you are battling against a reality that doesn't necessarily match your plans. And, of course, it's a joke, and working as a PM isn't necessarily as bad as all of that. But let's go ahead and test out the analogy and see if we can find some similarities. So managing projects really is a lot about dealing with people. First thing you do when you play Mortal Kombat is you select a player from a long list of fighters. And in project management, one of the first things that you have to figure out is who's going to be involved in the project. If the project's big enough, you're going to be faced with a large list of stakeholders. And these are people that are involved in some way. And as the project manager, it's your job to figure out what everybody's role is. And you're really the communications hub for everybody involved. And everybody that's coming to a project is coming with a different set of motivations, and that's going to influence all of the planning that you put into a project. I think it's also important that projects really exist in a larger context. So you've got business plans of the company that you're in, you've got technologies that you're working with, your company's probably got processes in place. All of these things are going to put constraints and pressures on your project. And so understanding the stakeholders is really a big part of figuring out that larger context. One thing that a lot of people think is that project management is all about the scheduling, right? It's thought of as like a scheduling exercise. So you figure out what you need to deliver, who's going to deliver each piece, and then you put together a schedule. It lists everything that needs to happen and when those activities are going to happen. And in practice, there's really a lot more that goes into it. So we talked about stakeholders and communications, but I think risk is one of the main things that project managers focus on as well. So that's what we're going to do tonight, is look beyond just the typical scheduling function of project management at some of the other parts as well. And a big part of this in managing projects is managing change. And no matter how good your initial plan is, things change. You've got to be able to anticipate those changes and figure out how you want to handle them. It could be as simple as having a change management process in place, or it could be complicated, like having multiple parallel plans in place to handle different potential outcomes. I'm actually working on a project right now where we're doing exactly that, and it gets very complicated. But the bottom line is, dealing with changes that could happen, which are risks, or changes that have happened. It's a really big part of project management. And the reality is, most projects don't succeed, right? Even if everybody's got good intentions, we've got realistic expectations, and we've aligned our incentives, so we're all working towards the same goal. Project management should be pretty straightforward, but it really isn't. So I'd like to hear in the chat real quick. Let me bring my chat window up again. How many of you have been on a project that hasn't gone to plan? Anybody been on a failed project? Yep, I'm getting some agreement here. All of them, nice. Yep. Yeah, and personal projects, exactly. Yeah, personal projects, business projects, school projects. And that's the thing, right? In reality, successful projects are pretty rare, right? So you can define different statistics online, but generally speaking, most projects fail to meet all or some of their objectives. And it's especially true for software projects. So tonight, we're going to look a little bit more closely at project management. We'll dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that project managers are dealing with, and hopefully you'll get a sense of what it is and how you can use it to further your development career if that's the route you're going. So first, I'm going to introduce myself. So my name's Jeff. I work for a software company called SAP. I've been in the consulting side of SAP for 5 years now. I just had my 5-year anniversary this past week. I started out as a developer a long time ago. I think I stopped as a developer about 15 years ago. Since then, I've been doing a lot of project and program management, mostly, well, all of it in software, mostly on the consulting side of things. I've got a PMP and a CSM, so a couple certifications. We'll look at those a little bit later on. And my experience is in a wide variety of environments. So Fortune 500, startups, consulting, big tech like SAP. And then more recently, I've also been a mentor here at Code Louisville, mentoring on the Python or data tracks and also on SQL. And I've been working in projects my entire career, right? Regardless of what the actual role is. So starting out, my very first job out of college as a web developer, doing ASP.NET, if anybody remembers that, making marketing websites for a small healthcare company. And then I spent, I think, 5 or 6 years as a software developer working in Java. So those were software development projects. And then I also got to work on some process improvement projects while I was doing my MBA. That was really interesting. Then system implementation and pricing products. So I worked for an insurance company for a while. And yeah, did projects that were both software system implementations where we would buy software from a vendor and then have to implement it, or also non-software related projects where we were doing insurance pricing changes, for example. Then I spent some time at a startup called True North Logic. There we were doing product implementation projects, right? So we had a software product that we were selling to our customers. I also started the project management office there, which we'll get into a little bit later in terms of careers. Then moved on to a consulting firm and did software development and consulting engagements working directly with customers. And then finally landed at SAP. And there I've been doing more internal stuff. So change management, strategy projects, mergers and acquisition projects, things like that. So sort of getting a little bit farther away from the technical side of it, but still all project management. And I think what I wanted to get across with this slide is, if you spend long enough in tech, you're going to be involved in projects, in a variety of different projects, both technical and non-technical. And I think it's definitely helpful to have a bit of an understanding of project management. And I think especially of where project managers are coming from. And that's really the point of this next one. What does this mean to me, right? So even if you're not really considering a career in project management, why should you care about it? Well, I think eventually, if you do this long enough, you're going to be on a project somewhere. And I think it's really helpful to understand what is motivating a project manager and try and understand what they're trying to do when they're reaching out to you for an estimate or a deadline or something like that. And I think it'll help you guide them to be a little bit better at their job. I think there's definitely some friction I've seen over the years between technical people and project managers. And I think as technical people, I'll call myself that for a little bit, we can do a lot to sort of guide project managers to help them be a little bit better at their jobs. I think it's also really a good way to spot a toxic workplace culture. So if you're interviewing at companies, I think there are some questions that you can ask about how they handle, how they manage their projects, who makes the decisions, things like that. And as you're looking for technical jobs, it can help you to ask about the project management approach to try and get a better sense for what it would be like to actually work there. And then, of course, you might be interested in a project management career. And so this, session tonight might help with that as well. So before I dive into the content, I'm going to be talking about some jargon that project managers use. And I think that's a good way to sort of explain where they're coming from and what it is they're trying to do. And then we'll take a look at some roles and careers and certifications that you can do if you're interested in being a project manager. And then I think we'll have a pretty good amount of time at the end for some Q&A. But before I dig into this, I'm opening up the chat. Let me know in the chat, are there any other things you'd like to hear about, any topics you'd like to cover tonight? Careers, got it? How to keep a project on track. Yep. Making a job a career, nice. Yep, typical developer project flow, good. We'll be looking at that a little bit. Okay, these are great, and I think these are pretty well covered in the content that I've got. But as we both said, we've got time for Q&A at the end. So if I don't get to something, definitely hold me to it and ask some questions. All right, let's kick it off with jargon. So I've picked a couple terms that project managers like to toss around, and I'm going to go through these one by one. Excuse me, and use them to sort of speak a little bit more about project management as a whole. And yeah, so let's just get right into it. So let's start off with waterfall versus agile. I think if you're in software development long enough and you're working on projects, you're going to hear this a lot. And the main point here is that there's more than two ways to manage a software project. Just saw a chat, imposter syndrome. Awesome. Yep. Let's get to that. I've got a lot of that myself, so we'll definitely get to that. So yeah, there's more than two ways to manage a software project, but if you talk to a lot of companies, a lot of startups, for example, will go on and on about being agile and not being waterfall, whereas some of the older companies like IBM or SAP or stuff like that are more known for their waterfall approach. We'll talk about each of these. I think some people might think a team would either use one or the other, but in reality, most teams fall somewhere on a spectrum between being truly agile and truly waterfall. But let's dig into this and see what we're talking about. So when we talk about agile and waterfall, these are really project management methodologies, right? It's an approach for how you can manage a project. And I've got three methodologies listed here on the screen. The first two, Kanban and Scrum, are examples of agile methodologies. And then I've got waterfall down at the bottom. And you can see that as you move from Kanban towards waterfall, you get more and more overhead in the process, right? There's more and more involved in managing a project. We'll start with the first one, Kanban. So Kanban comes from the 50s, from the automotive industry, from Toyota, right? And it's a very, very lightweight process, right? Basically, it's a glorified task list where you have a backlog of tasks, you have tasks that are being worked on, that are in progress, and you have tasks that are done. And the focus of Kanban is really the process itself, right? And so it looks like I've got some typos on the slide, but they've got concepts like work in process, which is a limit of the amount of work that can be done by the team at one time, for example. And they've got sort of a strict process flow. It starts at one end and ends at the other. Another really interesting thing about Kanban is it's continuous, right? It's not time bound. So you don't set a schedule for Kanban. Things, activities, or deliverables move through a Kanban process, and we'll take a look at a Kanban board in a second, but it's continuous. It doesn't use time bounding or time boxing for planning. So in the middle here, I've got Scrum, right? So it's a little bit more overhead than Kanban, but it's not quite as heavy as waterfall. And Scrum comes from the 90s or the early 2000s, depending on how you want to look at it. It comes out of our industry, out of software. And one of the main characteristics is it is time boxed, right? So typically in Scrum, you work in sprints. They could be 2 weeks, they could be 3 weeks, they could be longer. And you go through these repetitive ceremonies where you do some planning, and then when you're in the sprint, you do stand-ups like we do in a lot of the Code Louisville classes here. At the end of the sprint, you do a review. You could do a retrospective to try and improve the process. But basically, you're going through a cycle. And that cycle, the length of the cycle, the length of the sprint is usually determined by the team. It's got a little bit more process overhead, right? It's got all these ceremonies, but it's not as heavy as waterfall. So this third one I've got on here, waterfall, this is the heaviest process of these three. And this one comes out of the 70s and the aerospace industry. The origin story of this one is really pretty interesting. And basically, the way that we use waterfall today makes you think that the people didn't actually fully read the paper where waterfall was introduced and presented. They got about halfway through and stopped there and said that's good enough. And that's actually what we use today in the software development lifecycle. It relies really heavily on documentation. It's very documentation heavy. And in the SLDC, for example, the software development lifecycle, it typically follows a standard process. You gather some requirements, you design a solution, you implement the solution, you test it, you deploy it, and then you provide some support or maintenance for it. And then you would iterate through that lifecycle for every release or for every product that you're putting out. And you can see how you end up planning the entire project all at once, all the way from the requirements, all the way through the end of the deployment. And so it ends up being a much longer process. And in order to be able to figure out what you have to test and deploy at the very beginning, it requires a lot of documentation. And there's usually a rigid handoff. All right, so let's see what these things look like. So Kanban. Kanban's got a lot going on here, right? So the main thing here are these cards. And each card, these little Post-it notes, they represent a task or an activity that needs to be completed. Each of the columns represents a stage in your workflow. So in this scenario, it would be a basic software development process. But with Kanban, you can decide what your columns are, what each stage is. You start with a backlog of things that you need to develop. You break that backlog down into stories. Stories are really just distinct units of functionality, things that can be estimated. And you'll notice it's a continuous process, right? So Post-its just move from left to right across the board until they're done, and then you take them off. You could take a collection of items that are done and put them into a release, for example, a software release. Scrum, on the other hand, is more of a cycle. It's got a lot of the same elements though, right? So you still have a backlog. Those backlogs are broken down into stories and prioritized during a ceremony called sprint planning. And so that gives you a set of things that you're going to work on in a specific sprint. Those sprints are time bound, right? So it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks. It's really determined by the team. While you're in a sprint, you could have daily or less frequent stand-up calls where people are coordinating and letting somebody know if there's a blocker. And then the idea with Scrum and this agile, the cyclical agile approach is the end result of a sprint should be shippable software, right? It should be functioning software that you can ship. So you call that an increment, and at the end of your sprint, you do a review where you take the software that's been developed and you show that to somebody, typically the product owner, and they validate that yes, this is what we wanted, and then it gets sent out. And then you can see it's got the feedback loop at the top, the sprint retrospective, right, where you then collect your feedback about how things went that sprint. So typically that's like a stoplight system, red light, green light, things you want to not do in the future, things that you want to continue doing, things that you want to change. And then waterfall, as we mentioned, is a slightly older approach, typically done for longer projects, things that would last months or years. It relies on completely planning out your project and very thorough documentation. There are typically also very strict transitions from one phase to another, quality gates that you have to pass through in order to go from requirements design, etc. And the reality is that most teams end up being some sort of mishmash between these different approaches or methodologies, right? And so you could call that agile fall or sprint fall, or I like to call it a series of increasingly dangerous waterfalls. It's some sort of approach that uses a combination of sprints and waterfalls is pretty common. So I'm going to head back to the chat. Looks like we've got a lot of things in here. In Scrum, yeah, in Scrum, what do you do when you're not sprinting? There can be sprints where you're doing some planning or system design, right? And so they could call that like a sprint zero or a design sprint. So there are some sprints where you're not writing code, but typically, if you're following that approach, it's a very regular cadence. Every 2 weeks you'll follow the same cadence and ceremonies, and that's just how the time is managed. Does NASA still follow this methodology? That's a great question. I don't know. They were doing it in the 70s, and it had a huge influence on our industry. Be interesting to see what they're doing today versus SpaceX or some of the competitors. Continuous integration, how does that relate to the project management styles. So I think continuous integration and continuous deployment, right, CI/CD, those relate really well to a Kanban style approach or a Scrum style approach, right? So at the end of every sprint, if you're doing Scrum, you have shippable software, and if you've got CI/CD implemented, then that software is going to go through all of the steps in that process in order to get it out into production. So it's typically more of an agile or Scrum approach. With waterfall, it's typically more of a big bang deployment approach as opposed to continuous integration or continuous deployment. Checking the chat. So a question for you guys. If you're currently working in software, let us know. Are you using some sort of agile methodology or using waterfall? Is it just pure chaos?
We're using Scrum.
Nice. Yes, haphazard is a methodology. Yep. Been there. Chaos and Kanban, nice. Yeah, and Scrum, okay, good. So a couple votes for Scrum. So, and I think this is a great question for trying to vet a company that you're trying to join. And I'm not suggesting that there's a right answer in terms of what methodology they use, but it's going to give you a little bit of insight into what it would be like to work there, what the sort of day-to-day would be, what routines you would get into. And I think it'll help you ask follow-up questions about it. So for example, if they're doing waterfall, you know, as a developer, I would be really interested to understand what the support and maintenance looks like after a big bang deployment, right? Because usually there's sort of a frenetic amount of support that's provided to customers after a big deployment like that, and that could impact your quality of life as a developer, because that might mean that you're going to be on call supporting these things. If they're doing Kanban, it'd be good to understand a little bit more about their philosophy with Kanban, and how well is it working for them? Are they able to limit the work in process? Are they able to limit how much work is thrown at the development team at one time? And then how do they estimate things like velocity if they don't use sprints and they're just using Kanban? If they're using Scrum, I think it's really, there's a lot to unpack there, because there are, I guess, a little bit more in terms of roles with Scrum. So if somebody's using Scrum, well, really any of these, but I've seen it mostly with Scrum, I'd really want to understand what roles they're actually using, right? Do they have a Scrum Master? Do they have somebody whose role it is just to manage this process? Does that Scrum Master do anything else? Do they have product owners? If it's a product type company, and what's the relationship of the product owner with the Scrum Master? How involved is the product owner in the daily Scrum? The answer should be 0, not involved at all. So once you understand what kind of methodology they're using, it can really open up other questions that you can ask to then get a sense for what it's going to be like to work there. Red flags. Yeah. To me, one of the red flags is if somebody thinks they're doing Agile, like Scrum or Kanban or something else. There are other ones as well. They think they're doing that, and you ask a little bit deeper and it starts to sound more like waterfall, then it's probably a bit of a mess. And you just want to be aware of what you're getting yourself into. I think if people are really focused on estimates and deadlines, and especially who's doing the estimating, right? If it's anybody other than the person doing the work, either the developer or the tester or the person writing documentation, I think that would be a red flag, right? You know, if you're doing some sort of group interview or a series of interviews and you get to talk to a project manager, just be really interesting to hear their approach, right? Are they more on the micromanagement side of it? Or are they really more about sort of managing the process and clearing blockers? You know, is their focus more on meeting the schedule, or is it more sort of externally focused on stakeholder management and risk management and things like that? Any other questions on methodologies? All right. So that's a pretty high level view of the different types of project management and how you would interact with that as a developer. So another piece of jargon that project managers like to throw around are constraints, or specifically the triple constraint. And it's sort of a classic view of what a project manager is dealing with when they're running a project. And the idea is that a project manager is trying to produce deliverables, right? So that's the scope within a certain schedule and under budget, right? That's the end all be all goal of being a project manager, is to deliver your project within schedule and under budget. And this view of things, the sort of classic view of it, is thought of as a zero-sum game, right? So the idea is if there's a change to one of these things, then it's going to have some sort of impact on the others, right? So if you increase the scope, if you say instead of doing just an Android app, we're going to do an Android app and a web app and a command line app or a green screen or whatever. If you start increasing scope, then it probably is going to have an impact on the amount of time it's going to take, and it's probably going to have impact on what it's going to cost you. Or if you want to reduce the amount of time that a project takes, it's probably going to have an impact on scope or the cost. You might need to hire more developers, or you might need to be a little bit less ambitious in terms of what you're trying to deliver. Or if you're trying to reduce the cost of a project because the broader economic environment has changed, well, then a good project manager is going to come back and say, well, you're going to have to reduce the scope, or we're going to have to take a little bit more time to do this because people are doing their day jobs at the same time, that sort of thing. So this is sort of a classic view, a zero-sum game, where anytime you change one of these variables, it's going to impact the others. But there's a more realistic view in that instead of just cost, time, and scope, there are other constraints on a project. And if you push time, for example, it could have an impact on quality or on resources or on the amount of risk that is in the project in terms of whether or not you're going to get that project done on time, right? So triple constraint is sort of an older way of looking at it. More realistic view uses these 6 constraints when they're looking at a project and they're trying to juggle. And if you think about what a project manager is really trying to do, scheduling, time is one part of it, but it's just one part, right? There's really more that they're trying to manage than just the scheduling aspect of it. All right, so I'm going to open up the chat again. Can anybody think of other constraints, other things that would potentially be a trade-off if you change one of these things? And feel free to unmute and say it if you want, or type it into the chat.
I was thinking reputation, but that will go with risk.
Yeah, and it gets a little fuzzy, but that's absolutely right. Reputation or the image of the company, absolutely.
I was also thinking human capital, but that's also resources.
Mm-hmm.
If if it's like a international project, you have to worry about time differences and potentially language barriers. Even if English or the same language is spoken, it's a cultural difference that can definitely affect projects.
Absolutely. It creates a whole level of complexity. So I think in the software industry, if you look at it from that perspective, I think security could be another constraint that you might throw on top of this. And you could argue that that's part of quality. I think compliance, right? There's typically compliance involved depending on what industry or domain you're working with. So in finance or payment processing, there's a lot of compliance issues. In education, there are compliance issues. So I think it's good to think of other things beyond just cost, time, and scope, sort of the classic. All right, so another piece of jargon that project managers and lots of managers like to throw around is critical path. What's on the critical path? That's what they're always asking the project manager. A critical path is pretty easy to define. It's the tasks that define the minimum amount of time that's necessary to complete the project, right? So in this scenario, the bars that I've highlighted in red, those are the items that are on the critical path. Why does that matter? What does it mean to be on the critical path? It means that those are the ones that you want to pay special attention to when it comes to risk, right? Because if things don't go as planned, it's going to have a direct impact on the end date of your project. Whereas the two that I have in gray there, those are not on the critical path. So if they get delayed, it's not going to have a direct impact on the critical path. Now, something could get pushed back so much that it eventually gets onto the critical path, but this is really what they're talking about. Which activities do we need to be the most worried about when it comes to risk? There's a couple other words that I put on the screen here. Crashing. This is usually the knee-jerk reaction when things aren't going as planned and we need the project to end faster. They'll try and crash the project. And what that means is they'll try and do two activities at the same time that theoretically should occur one after the other. An example of this would be, especially if you're doing parallel projects, the one that I'm working on right now, they suggested running UAT in parallel across two different systems. The problem is you can't just throw more work at the same number of people, and you can't necessarily add more people because they don't have the knowledge of the project. And so crashing is really problematic. Another word that I've got on here is float. So if you've got a large gap between two activities that are dependent on each other, you call that float. And so the more technical side of project management is doing schedule analysis and calculating the amount of float that you have overall in a project, and that gives you a sense for how risky your project is. If there's more float, there's less risk. If there's less float, there's more risk. I think this gives you maybe an idea of why a lot of project managers are so focused on estimates and deadlines, right? Because this is really what they're being asked from their managers or whoever is overseeing the project. And they're trying to understand not just, are you going to get done with XYZ on time, but what they're trying to understand is, how is that going to impact the larger project. Is this going to have an impact on my critical path? Is this something that I need to be worried about? And I think it gets expressed as micromanagement, and that's not good. But maybe you can see why they're so focused on that here is this. Usually project managers are measured on whether they're delivering on time and on budget, and deadlines and estimates really play into that a lot. I think one big red flag would be if project managers try and do estimates themselves. That would be a red flag. All right. Let's take a look at a risk matrix. So we talked about risk on the last one, right? You want to analyze your critical path, figure out which activities you really need to pay attention to. Once you figure that out, you need to think what could go wrong for each one of those activities. And all sorts of things can go wrong. For anything that can go wrong, you want to quantify it. And you usually do that in sort of a risk assessment matrix. So on the left-hand side of this, you're talking about the severity. If Bob doesn't meet his deadline, what is the implication of that, right? Is it catastrophic? Will the company go out of business? Or is it superficial? It's no big deal. We can clean it up after we deploy. You know, nobody's going to worry about it, right? So you have to first consider how severe an event would be if it were to occur. And then the likelihood, right? How probable is it that this is actually going to occur? How probable is it that Bob's going to miss his deadline, right? And so it basically gives you a very simple matrix like this, where catastrophic things that are very likely to happen are probably the things that you should be the most focused on, and superficial things that are unlikely to happen are things you wouldn't want to focus on. And all this does is tell you how much of a plan you need to have for each one of those things, right? If you're in the red, you need to have a very detailed mitigation plan, and you should probably be communicating that plan very high up the chain, right? Because that's who's going to care about it. If you've got something that's in the yellow here, you probably need to be aware of it. You probably need to track it, but you're probably not sounding the alarm in every status call about a yellow. And then if it's in the green, you might track it and just monitor sporadically to see if either the severity or the likelihood has changed over time.
You give an example of like what might be, you know, a few of these risks. So
yeah. So the easiest way to think of it is if you go back to this, right? So if I am on my critical path and I'm doing the analysis, right? And a risk in analysis could be that I use the wrong tech stack to solve a technical problem, right? And so that could be a risk in terms of quality, right? The quality of your analysis is not great. Another one could be on the requirement side. A very, very common risk is to just miss a requirement, right? This happens all the time, right? And so that could be a risk in terms of scope. It could have impacts in terms of time, cost. It could hit a lot of this. And so I think those are two big ones. In terms of time, if you have a very strict deadline, so for example, imagine, just hypothetically, that your company is moving from one data center to another, right? There's a lot going on in that kind of a project, and you have to rewrite some code in order to make your software work in the new environment. There could be very critical time risk there, right? If you aren't able to write and test the code in time for that to happen, then it could have a really huge impact in terms of cost if you have to have two data centers going for longer than you anticipated, right? So you want to go through each of the items on your list that are on the critical path and say, how could this impact the time or the cost or some other aspect of my project. And then most importantly, not just identify them and put them in a spreadsheet somewhere, but figure out, okay, what are we going to do to make sure that that doesn't happen? Or if it does happen, what are we going to do to make sure it's not catastrophic? Vicki, did that answer the question?
That actually was mine, but yes.
Oh, sorry. Didn't hear where
okay.
it come from. Yeah, and so a good project manager is really going to spend a lot of their time worrying about what could go wrong, and then figuring out, hopefully with the help of the team, what we can do to mitigate the risk in some way. You can accept the risk that, okay, there's a low chance it might happen, we'll just have to accept it. You can, there's a bunch of different risk mitigation strategies, but you have to figure out what strategy you're going to use and then come up with a solid plan that will address it. All right, just a couple more. RACI, not sure if everybody's heard this term already. A RACI is a form of stakeholder analysis. So we talked about that at the very beginning, you know, stakeholders, all the people that are involved in a project. RACIs really help you visualize and understand how the different people or teams or roles on a project are going to work together to get you from point A to point B. And it stands for responsible, accountable, support, consult, or informed. And basically you're saying for every role involved in your project or your program, what is their interaction with the project? Are they responsible for getting it done? Are they actually going to be writing the code? Are they accountable for getting it done? Are they the project manager or the manager who's accountable for delivering something? Are they supporting it by providing information to the person who is responsible? Are they consulting on it? Are they, I think consulting is more providing information to the person responsible. Supporting would be doing some of the subtasks for the person responsible. And then informed, are they stakeholders that just need to be aware of this? So for example, if your software is touching or changing in some way, and that could have integration impacts on another part of the company or another team, then they need to be informed of those changes so that they can react to it and provide feedback to you, you know, whether or not you should be making those changes. So you can see there could be a wide variety of roles, and they could be involved in the project in different ways. And usually what a RACI turns into, other than a fight of org charts, usually what it turns into is a communications plan, right? So then now that you understand what people's role are on the project, then you can better understand how much communication they need, how frequently do they need it, what style of communication is right for those groups, who are the audiences, who's running it, that sort of thing. So stakeholder management is about understanding who all is involved, what's their role in the project, and then how are we going to communicate with them. And really, you know, a lot of being a project manager is being that sort of central hub, coming up with a plan for how all of this is going to work. And you're not necessarily personally communicating all of this, but you're defining how it's going to work, what processes are going to be in place for the communication of information, so that everybody gets what they need and we're getting the feedback that we need. All right. So next up, I'm going to go into the career side of it. Before I do that, let me check the chat real quickly. Any other questions I missed? Yeah, ethical constraints. Yep, absolutely. All right, how are blockers perceived? Blockers are risk. So the definition of a blocker is something is preventing you from getting your task done, and that something is external to your control, or maybe even external from your team, right? And From my perspective, I'd want to know about blockers as soon as possible, because blockers are risk, right? They are putting risk on the activity that the person who's blocked might not get done on time. And as the person in charge of the communication and the stakeholders, that's where a blocker goes, right? It shouldn't just go into some spreadsheet to die. It should go into a to-do list for the project manager to figure out who can unblock and make that happen. Okay, all right. Without any other questions, let's just jump into careers really quickly. And this one, I just want to go super high level in terms of career path and certifications. I think those are two things that are interesting. I saw a couple questions about turning a job into a career and imposter syndrome, so we can capture those as well. But I think I'll start off with career paths and certifications. So in terms of career paths, when you're starting out in project management, especially if you're in a larger company, especially if they're working on larger projects or a lot of projects, there are really a lot of entry-level roles to get into project management. So being a, regardless of what the title is, coordinator, assistant project manager, project assistant, project management support, I've worked with people doing all of those types of roles, and it's incredibly helpful, because if you can imagine, if the project manager has to keep in their head all of the moving parts and be constantly assessing risk and making sure that it's communicated out and that we're unblocking things, there's a lot of documentation that goes alongside of that, and it can be very helpful to have somebody working with you to manage your risk log and your action items and all the things that are coming out of these meetings that you have to deal with. It's very helpful to have somebody to do that. On the flip side, if you're that person who's helping out, it's incredibly valuable to be part of that and be in those meetings and in those conversations and see how the project manager is thinking about it. And I think it's a great learning experience. Some of the certifications require a large amount of hands-on project management work, and doing one of these entry-level roles is a great way to get that hands-on experience, which then qualifies you for the certification. So then at the mid-level, you've got project manager, implementation manager, program manager, portfolio manager. A program is kind of like a project, but it's usually at an organizational level. And usually the outcome of a program is to add a new capability to an organization, right? So typically a program would have multiple projects or work streams or whatever you want to call them inside of it, with project managers on top of each one of those. And then you'd have a program management team above that that's coordinating across those projects. You could require coordination between finance, HR, IT. It just sort of depends on what the project is doing. So I hope I just answered that. What are the differences between project and program management? So program is sort of one step up. Portfolio manager, there you're looking at everything that a company is doing, right? So all of the programs that they have going on, all of the individual projects that they have going on. And at that level, you're worried about high-level budget, right? What are the high-level budget impacts that like a CFO would care about? High-level schedule and risk, things like that. And then you're also very concerned about resource allocation, right? Because at the company level, when you're working on a portfolio of projects, it's more about, are we allocating our teams in the way that's going to deliver the most value for the company, right? So it's portfolio is really looking across multiple projects and programs and trying to figure out things like resources and risks, things like that. All right, so I talked about projects, programs, portfolios. Then at the senior level, it's just, senior project manager, director of projects, whatever. But then you also get into the PMO, right? PMO stands for Project Management Office, and it's usually a group of people that have that sort of portfolio function within a company, right? So they're the ones that are setting the standards for, here are the templates that we're using for our project management plans and for our communications plans and things like that. And then they're typically also the ones that go through and do the audits to make sure that the projects are following the guidelines that they're setting. And then they're typically also reporting at a high level on things like resource usage and budgeting and things like that. So a PMO is just a formal organization within your company that is doing portfolio management and sometimes project management or program management. And I don't know a non-glib way to talk about imposter syndrome, right? So I definitely have it as a programmer, as a project manager, as a manager. I think it's something that I've dealt with for 20 years now. And yeah, I don't know that there's a secret to it other than just leaning into it. And I guess the term's fake it till you make it. But don't fake it too hard, right? You don't want to say something that's incorrect, always be fact-based. But, I think a lot of people are doing that. I know that I've done that throughout my career.
And Jeff, I never would have dreamt that you have that syndrome.
Absolutely. So I've done a good job at faking it then. Perfect. I'll take it. All right. So that's the career side of it. On the certification side, I've just got a couple of them here. There's different levels of certification. So for example, the two on the left are offered by an organization called Project Management Institute, PMI. It's sort of a big one here in the US. And so they have entry-level certifications for associate project managers. Then they also have the PMP, which is, I think, probably the gold standard, at least in the US. There are other organizations out there. So like the Prince 2 Foundation is a little bit bigger in Europe. There's other ones as well. I've done the PMP. I would agree with this chart saying that it's a high study effort. I took 2 courses and I was a project manager for quite a while before I got my PMP. I did that back in like 2006, I think. And I'm so glad that I don't have to take that test anymore because I think it's gotten a lot harder. So I feel for you if you're just now considering a PMP. It's going to be a lot harder than what I had to go through. But I would really recommend a course if it's something that you want. I think it has value because it gives you a very good structure for thinking about all the different parts of a project. So I think there is some value to it. I think there's some value in the job market as well to a PMP. And then on the far right-hand side is one of the Agile certifications, the Certified Scrum Master. I've also got that one. And I would generally agree with this chart that it's a lot less study effort. I took a 1-week class and then passed it at the end of the week. And it's really just more about understanding the process, because as a Scrum Master, that's really what you're doing is you're there to facilitate that sprint process.
What scares me of the Scrum Master is the quantity of writing that you got to do.
It shouldn't be.
Oh, really? It shouldn't be?
Not in my experience. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I took one of those 1-week courses by some commercial company, and they just sit you in a conference room for a week and you sort of manage your way through a sprint basically, and learn all the terminology. It wasn't nearly as much effort as the PMP.
Good to know.
Any other questions on certifications? All right, so high level, I hope what I got across is that project management is a little bit more than just the schedule management and sort of micromanaging on estimates and deadlines, that there's a little bit more to think about in terms of risk and cost and quality, resources, things like that. And yeah, that's the end of the content. So I think we can open it up to any other questions.
So I came in a little late, so I apologize if you've already answered this, but what do you find most difficult as a project, or like what aspect of project management do you find most difficult?
So personally, I'm an introvert, like hardcore. That's why I started out as a developer, and I probably should have stayed on that path. And so for me, the most difficult part is that you are sort of the hub of communication, which means that you've got to talk to a lot of people. And I'm the kind that preferred the self-checkout at the grocery store instead of talking to anybody. So I think for me personally, that's the hardest part of it. I think so yeah, being interested in talking to people, I think would be a big benefit. And then also being detail oriented. Because at the end of the day, it really is tracking a lot of stuff in a spreadsheet or some sort of tool. And you really have to get it right. Things have to be fact-based, especially if you're getting a risk and pushing a risk up through levels of management above you. There are going to be a lot of questions, and you have to have your facts straight. So yeah, I think being people-oriented and detail-oriented.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, can't hear you.
Helps if I unmute rather than mute myself. Thank you so much for the great presentation. This was definitely a good overview of project management. So yes, thank you so much. We are hoping to bring back the Monday guest speaker series in September. And we'll get those dates available to everybody with topics as soon as possible. So thank you very much, and have a great night and a great break in between sessions.
Thank you.
Great.
Have a good
Thanks,
night.
everyone.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Emily.
Yep, thanks.
Good night, everyone.